There is a photograph that most people have never really stopped to look at. June 2004, the steps of the United States Capitol. An 82-year-old woman, tiny and slightly stooped, stands alone beside a flag-draped casket. Heads of state, generals, cameras, all watching. But she looks like she is somewhere else entirely. Like the noise of the world has gone quiet. And the only thing left is that coffin. That woman was Nancy Reagan, and the man inside that casket was the only reason, by her own admission, that she had ever gotten up in the morning. Most people know the surface version of her, the red dresses, the astrologer, the rumors of power behind the throne. What very few know is what came after the White House, what it truly cost her, and what it meant to keep going once he was gone. This is that story. Segment 9. Queen Nancy, the woman Washington loved to hate. To understand what happened at the end, you have to understand what happened at the beginning. Nancy Reagan was born in Francis Robbins in New York City on July 6, 1921, to a used car salesman and an actress. Her parents separated not long after she was born, and for the first 6 years of her life, she was raised by an aunt and uncle in Maryland, while her mother pursued her theatrical career. It was the kind of early childhood that leaves a mark. The particular loneliness of a child who is loved but not quite kept. When her mother remarried in 1929 to a prominent Chicago neurosurgeon named Loyal Davis, Nancy finally had the stability she had been waiting for. He adopted her. She took his name. She adored him. She studied at Smith College, tried her hand at acting like her mother, and eventually landed a 7-year contract with MGM in Hollywood. She was Nancy Davis by then, a competent and quietly ambitious actress with a moderate career. When the trajectory of her life changed in a way she hadn't expected, she met Ronald Reagan, then the president of the Screen Actors Guild, in 1951. They married the following year in a small ceremony on March 4, 1952, with only their close friends William Holden and Ardis Ankerson as witnesses. She was 30. He was 41. He had been married before to actress Jane Wyman. He had 2 children from that marriage, Maureen, an adopted son, Michael. Together, Ronald and Nancy would have 2 more children, Patricia, who would later go by Patty Davis, and Ron. Those who knew her well in those years say that from the beginning, the marriage consumed her completely. She organized her life around his schedule, his needs, his aspirations. When he moved into politics in California, winning the governorship in 1966, she went with him and got her first bitter taste of what public life would demand. People mocked her adoring expression at his speeches, the way she looked at him as though no one else in the room existed. The press called it the gaze, and usually not kindly. She didn't stop. When Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States on January 20, 1981, Nancy Reagan walked into the White House with a very clear sense of what she was there to do. She was there to protect Ronnie, to keep him safe, to make sure the people around him were worthy of him. Everything else was secondary. But Washington did not see it that way. Within weeks, the criticism had begun. She had commissioned new china for the White House, a set of 4,732 pieces at a cost of around $29,000, paid for with private donations, not taxpayer money. But the optics were disastrous. The country was in a recession. Ronald Reagan's administration was cutting federal programs, and the new First Lady was ordering custom china with a gold border and a crimson presidential seal. The nickname came quickly, Queen Nancy. She had also overseen a major redecoration of the White House private quarters, accepted expensive designer gowns on loan from top fashion houses, and hosted lavish state dinners, 56 of them over 8 years, that dripped with a kind of Hollywood glamour that Washington hadn't seen in years. Admirers said she brought back the elegance of the Kennedy era. Critics said she was completely out of touch. She was, by her own admission, wounded by the coverage. Those early months, already marked by an event that would change everything, were what she later called a lost year. Because just 69 days into Ronald Reagan's presidency, on March 30, 1981, a young man named John Hinckley Jr. stepped out of a crowd outside the Washington Hilton Hotel and fired 6 shots. One of them hit the president in the chest less than an inch from his heart. A Secret Service agent, a police officer, and a press secretary were also struck. Nancy had been at the White House when the call came. She was told initially that her husband had not been hit, but something made her push back. She asked again and she was told the truth. She raced to the hospital. Ronald Reagan, ever the charmer, reportedly told her not to worry as they prepared him for surgery. Something along the lines of hoping she knew that he had forgotten to duck. He was trying to make her laugh. She was not laughing. She sat at his bedside for 13 days. After that, nothing was ever quite the same for Nancy Reagan. From that day forward, she described living in a state of permanent low-grade terror. Every time Ronald Reagan walked out the door into a crowd in front of a camera, she held her breath. Every public appearance felt like a gamble, and in her desperation to find some kind of protection, some way to gain even a small measure of control over the uncontrollable, she turned to someone she had known since their Hollywood days, an astrologer named Joan Quigley. And what that decision set in motion for the presidency, for history, and ultimately for Nancy herself, is the part of this story that almost nobody has ever told in full. Segment 8, The Woman in San Francisco. The secret the White House kept. Joan Quigley was not a fringe figure. She was a Vesa graduate, a published author, a well-known San Francisco socialite who had appeared on television. In fact, she had first met Nancy Reagan years earlier on MV Griffin's talk show. Astrology was not new to the Reagans. Both of them had been reading horoscopes since their Hollywood days. But what began after the assassination attempt was something altogether different. Nancy started calling Quigley regularly. She would describe Ronald Reagan's upcoming schedule, and Quigley would consult her charts, checking planetary alignments, identifying dates she considered favorable or unfavorable, and Nancy would use that information to push for changes in the schedule. Travel plans were moved, press conferences were rescheduled, departure times were shifted. For years, no one outside a very small circle knew about any of this. White House aides were given the constraints on the president's schedule without explanation. Some grew frustrated, but they complied. Then came Ronald Reagan. Reagan, no relation to the president, had come from Wall Street, where he had run Merrill Lynch. He was brought in as Treasury Secretary in Ronald Reagan's first term. And then in 1985, he swapped positions with Chief of Staff James Baker. Reagan was forceful, organized, and confident in his own authority. From the moment he took that job, he found himself in a quiet war with the First Lady. She would call him repeatedly with guidance about the schedule, with concerns about this aid or that policy, with her assessment of what was good for Ronnie and what wasn't. Reagan found it maddening. He later said he believed he had become chief of staff to the president, not to the president's wife. The breaking point came with Iran-Contra. In late 1986, it became public that members of the Reagan administration had secretly arranged for the sale of weapons to Iran, which was under an arms embargo, and had then quietly directed the proceeds to Nicaraguan rebels known as the Contras. It was one of the most significant political scandals of the Reagan presidency. And as it unfolded, Nancy concluded that Ronald Reagan had failed her husband, that he had allowed the chaos to happen on his watch, and that he was the wrong person to be handling the fallout. She pushed for him to go. Reagan resisted. For months, both sides leaked unflattering stories to the press. The feud became public and ugly. In February 1987, Reagan resigned or was effectively pushed out, depending on whose account you trust. He did not go quietly. In 1988, with the Reagan presidency approaching its final year, Reagan published a memoir. In it, he described the astrology arrangement in extraordinary detail. He wrote that virtually every major move and decision made during his time as chief of staff had been cleared in advance with a woman in San Francisco who drew up horoscopes to make certain the planets were in favorable alignment. He didn't know her name at the time of writing, though Time magazine quickly identified her as Quigley. The story landed like a grenade. The White House confirmed that Nancy had in fact consulted an astrologer while insisting that no policy decisions had ever been based on it. Ronald Reagan said flatly that astrology had never influenced his decisions. Nancy, in her 1989 memoir, acknowledged the practice but pushed back on how it had been characterized, describing it not as superstition, but as a desperate attempt to keep her husband alive after watching someone try to kill him. She wrote that she was doing everything she could think of to protect him, that she couldn't understand what it was like to have your husband shot at and nearly killed and then have him walk into enormous crowds every single day, any one of whom could be carrying a weapon. She wasn't wrong about the fear. The question was always whether the method was appropriate. And that debate has never fully been settled. What is undeniable is this. The revelation changed how history would see Nancy Reagan's role in the White House. No longer just an elegant hostess or a devoted wife, but a woman who had been operating quietly in the engine room of the presidency itself. And soon enough, those same qualities, the protectiveness, the fierce loyalty, the willingness to fight, would be called on in a way no astrologer could have predicted. But before that story begins, the Reagans had to leave Washington. And what awaited them back in California would be the quietest, most devastating chapter of their lives, and the one that would define everything about how people would eventually remember Nancy Reagan. Segment 7, The Long Goodbye, Alzheimer's and the Disappearing Man. In January 1989, Ronald and Nancy Reagan flew back to California. Wealthy friends had helped them purchase a home on St. Cloud Road in the affluent Bear neighborhood of Los Angeles. There were also trips to Rancho del Cielo, their beloved ranch in the hills above Santa Barbara, where Ronald loved to ride horses and clear brush and feel like himself. Those first years looked from the outside like a pleasant retirement. He gave speeches. They attended events. She continued her anti-drug work through the Nancy Reagan Foundation. Life on the surface seemed manageable, but Nancy had been watching her husband for years with the eyes of someone who was always looking for what others might miss. And sometime in the early 1990s, she began to notice things. He was forgetting names more than usual, repeating himself, struggling sometimes with the simplest things. She had always known him to be slightly forgetful in social situations. He had long masked this with humor and easy charm. But this was different. Something had shifted underneath. In 1994, Ronald Reagan gave what would turn out to be his final public speech at a gathering in Washington for his 83rd birthday. He delivered his remarks, and the audience responded warmly, as they always did. But when he and Nancy returned to their hotel suite afterward, he paused, looked around, and admitted he wasn't quite sure where he was. Shortly after, Nancy took him to the Mayo Clinic. When the doctors came back with their findings, the word they used was Alzheimer's disease. For Nancy, it was a verdict she had already been bracing for. By the time you seek out answers, something has already told you that something is deeply wrong. On November 5, 1994, Ronald Reagan wrote a letter to the American people by hand in still strong script, telling them that he had begun the journey that would lead him into the sunset of his life. It was a remarkable act of public honesty. Very few public figures, especially at that level, had ever spoken so openly about an Alzheimer's diagnosis. For Nancy, the journey that came next was unlike anything she had imagined. The early years were almost bearable. Ronald still went for walks. He still dressed meticulously, still smiled at everyone, still had the instinctive courtesy that had defined him his whole adult life. People who saw him during this period often said he looked terrific. But beneath the surface, the man Nancy had known, the one who wrote her love letters and made her laugh and told her she was the reason he got up in the morning, was beginning to recede. He would wake up some days almost normal and other days unsure of where he was. He would forget at times that he had ever lived in the White House. He could no longer keep track of what year it was, or sometimes even what season. Nancy slept in the same bed beside him as the disease progressed, lying next to a man who would wake up each day a little less certain of who she was. She once told a television commentator quietly outside the Reagan Library that Alzheimer's was worse than the assassination attempt because at least with the shooting there had been fear and then relief. This was something else. This was a separation that happened while he was still physically there. A slow erasure of the person she loved one day at a time. She called it the long goodbye. There were practical losses that followed. Ronald could no longer ride horses, the one outdoor activity he had truly loved. His old Secret Service agent had to tell him gently that it was no longer safe. Reagan reportedly had tears running down his face. His response, telling the agent it was okay, that he would be fine, was somehow the most heartbreaking thing about it. Nancy sold the ranch in 1998. There was no point keeping it, and she began what would become a decade of near-total devotion, rarely leaving the Bear house, quietly managing the staff who helped care for him, protecting his dignity with the same ferocity she had once used to protect his reputation. In the process, She also found a cause she would fight for with everything she had. Segment 6, The Battle She Chose. Stem cells and the fight with Washington. Watching Ronald Reagan disappear into Alzheimer's did something to Nancy Reagan that surprised people who had only known her as a conservative Republican's wife. It made her angry, not at the disease itself. There was no single target for that anger. But at the feeling that more could be done, that science had answers it wasn't yet being allowed to pursue, and that politics was getting in the way. The subject was embryonic stem cell research. In the early 2000s, there was genuine scientific excitement around the possibility that stem cells derived from human embryos could eventually lead to treatments or even cures for diseases like Alzheimer's. The research was controversial because of the nature of the embryos involved, and in August 2001, President George W. Bush had signed an executive order severely limiting federal funding for it. The decision drew strong support from religious conservatives within the Republican Party. Nancy Reagan, Republican First Lady, devoted Catholic stepfather's daughter, did not care about any of that. What she cared about was Ronnie. She began speaking publicly and forcefully in favor of expanded stem cell research. She met with scientists. She lobbied politicians quietly but persistently. At a dinner in Washington, she reportedly pulled Bush's chief of staff, Andy Card, aside and pressed him directly to reconsider the administration's position. The administration did not change course. She kept pushing anyway. She co-founded the Ronald and Nancy Reagan Research Institute with the Alzheimer's Association. She used every platform available to her to make the case that the science deserved to be funded. And she did this as a woman who was by that point in her 80s and spending most of her time as a full-time caregiver. It was a remarkable pivot for someone who had been painted for years as a woman interested only in fashion and social positioning. And it earned her something she had never quite managed to win during the White House years: genuine widespread admiration across party lines. Republicans who had cheered the original policy. Democrats who had despised Queen Nancy. Scientists who might never have voted for a Reagan in their lives. For a brief, strange moment, she was everyone's cause. It also put her on a collision course with a party she still considered her own. Her son Ron, the younger, was more liberal and had publicly broken with Republican orthodoxy on a number of issues. Her daughter, Patty Davis, had spent years estranged from the family over political and personal disagreements. The family dynamics had always been complicated. But on this issue, they found something to agree on. Meanwhile, back at the Bear House, the man they were all fighting for was fading. By 2003, Ronald Reagan was rarely leaving the house. He required constant supervision. Nancy supervised his caregivers, managed his medical needs, and spent hours each day simply being present, a presence he may not always have recognized, but which she refused to withdraw. There are accounts of her reading to him, sitting beside him, holding his hand. In his final months, she almost never left home. She was 82 years old, and she was doing this nearly alone with staff and a small circle of family and friends in a house on St. Cloud Road in Los Angeles. There is a detail from these final months that has stayed with people who followed the story closely. Ronald Reagan's personal physician, Dr. John Hutton, would later describe NY's devotion during this period as extraordinary even by the standards of caregiving, which is a world full of extraordinary devotion. She was there in the mornings. She was there in the evenings. On the days when he seemed more present, she would sit close to him. On the days when he seemed to have gone somewhere unreachable, she would still sit close to him. She published a collection of his letters to her in 2000. I love you, Ronnie. The letters of Ronald Reagan to Nancy Reagan. And reading them, it is not hard to understand what she was mourning, even while he was still alive. The man in those letters was funny, tender, extravagant in his affection for her. He wrote to her constantly throughout their marriage, on Valentine's Day, from hotel rooms, from campaign stops, from the Oval Office. In one letter, he told her he was not whole without her, that she was life itself to him, that when she was gone, he was merely waiting for her to return so he could start living again. That man who had written those words was gone, or mostly gone, years before his heart finally stopped. And then, on the morning of June 5, 2004, after nearly a decade of Alzheimer's disease, Ronald Reagan died of pneumonia. He was 93 years old, And at the very last moment, according to their daughter Patty, he opened eyes that had been closed for days and looked directly at Nancy. Clear, she said, full of something that she had not seen in a very long time. Nancy later said it was the greatest gift he could have given her. Segment 5, The Week the World Watched and What Came After. What happened next was one of the most elaborate and emotionally charged public ceremonies the United States had seen in decades. Nancy Reagan had planned it. All of it. She had been thinking about this for years, about what Ronnie deserved, about the tribute that was owed to him, about how history should receive him, and she had organized every detail of a 7-day state funeral with the same precision and control she had always brought to everything. The country watched. His body lay in repose at the Reagan Presidential Library first, then was flown to Washington where it lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda for 34 hours. Hundreds of thousands of people filed past. Heads of state came. Former presidents came. Margaret Thatcher, despite her own declining health, had recorded a tribute rather than deliver it live, understanding she could not trust herself through it in person. Nancy was at the center of every event. She stood in the rain at the Capitol. She sat through the national funeral service at the Washington National Cathedral. She was composed, controlled, almost eerily stoic until the very end at the sunset burial service at the library in Smile Valley. It was there finally that she allowed herself to break. She kissed the casket and mouthed something quiet that no microphone caught. She received the folded flag and then for the first time in 52 years she went home alone. The bare house was the same house. His clothes were still in the closet for some time. The household routines that had been organized around his care, the caregivers, the medical equipment, the structured hours were gone. And in their place was silence. Friends and biographers who spoke with Nancy in the years that followed described her as truly alone in a way that was hard to watch. She had built her entire adult life around one person. He had been the gravitational center of everything she did. And now there was no center. She told friends she missed him constantly. She continued to sleep in the same room. She kept photographs everywhere. She spoke about him as though he were still very much present, and in some sense for her, he always was, but she did not disappear, and that was what surprised people. Segment 4, Keeper of the Flame, The Final Decade. Grief for Nancy Reagan did not mean retreat. In the years after Ronald Reagan's death, she became what people close to her called the Keeper of the Flame, the most dedicated guardian of his memory and legacy. She threw herself into the work of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Smile Valley with an intensity that impressed even those who had known her for decades. She attended anniversary events. She received guests. She met with scholars and politicians and foreign leaders who came to pay their respects. In 2005, she was honored at a Washington gala with guests ranging from Dick Cheney to Condoleezza Rice to Harry Reid, a bipartisan gathering that reflected how her reputation had shifted in these later years. In 2007, she attended Gerald Ford's funeral. In 2011, she officiated at the ceremony marking Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday. She also hosted not one but 2 Republican presidential primary debates at the Reagan Library in May 2007 and January 2008. She was in her mid to late 80s. She was still showing up. The stem cell research advocacy continued as well. She had not given up. She was no longer fighting specifically for Ronnie. That battle was over. But she kept making the case. Kept lending her name and presence to the cause, understanding that whatever momentum she had built might help families still in the middle of what she had already been through. Those who spent time with her during this period often noted something that surprised them. She had been described for years as brittle, imperious, controlling, a woman who made enemies easily and held grudges longer. And some of that was certainly true. But in these final years the edges seemed to soften. Or perhaps it was simply that the armor she had always worn in public, the composed First Lady performance, had become unnecessary. There was nothing left to protect in the way she had once protected it. She talked more openly about the loneliness, about what it meant to have structured your whole existence around another person and then find yourself without them, about how strange it was to go to events where people still treated her as if she were half of something when she was now entirely alone. Her health, meanwhile, was beginning to show the weight of everything she had carried. Segment 3. The body keeps the score. Health declines and falls. Nancy Reagan had always been small. In her White House years, she had been described as slender to the point of delicate. By her 80s, she had become genuinely fragile. She had dealt with breast cancer during the White House years, undergoing a mastectomy in 1987 at a time when the subject was still heavily stigmatized. She had been frank about it, following the example of Betty Ford, who had spoken openly about her own breast cancer diagnosis a decade earlier. NY's openness at the time was considered by many to be a significant act of public service. Her willingness to discuss it helped bring the subject into mainstream conversation. But by her late 80s and into her 90s, more serious problems were emerging. She suffered a series of falls at her bare home that resulted in broken bones. Each fall, each fracture, each recovery was a marker of how much had changed since the days when she had walked the White House halls with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. The falls were kept mostly private. Nancy did not want to be seen as diminished. She still had work to do. Her last major television interview was for a PBS documentary in 2010 conducted by anchor Judy Woodruff. She talked about her husband, about the library, about their life together. She was sharp. She was precise. She was still Nancy Reagan. But public appearances became increasingly rare. The woman who had hosted 56 state dinners, who had organized a week-long state funeral, who had stood before the United Nations, was spending more and more time in the bare house that held all the memories she had left. Friends visited. Her daughter Patty, whose relationship with her mother had been strained for years over disagreements that had played out publicly in books and interviews, had slowly moved toward reconciliation. They were never going to agree on everything. They were never going to pretend the hard years hadn't happened. But there was a gradual drawing back together that those around them found moving and, given the history, remarkable. Her son Ron too remained close. Her stepson Michael, who had had his own complicated history with the family, had publicly expressed affection for her in the years after Ronald Reagan's death. It was not a perfect family. It had never been a perfect family. Nancy had never pretended otherwise. But in these last years, it was a family that was showing up. The bare house became the world in these final months. A small world, but hers. Segment 2, the morning it ended. On the morning of Sunday, March 6, 2016, Nancy Reagan died at her home in Bear. The cause was congestive heart failure. She was 94 years old. The announcement came from the Reagan Foundation through her, from presidents, former presidents, foreign leaders, from people who had loved her, and people who had spent decades criticizing her. President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama released a statement expressing their sorrow. Former President George W. Bush called her fiercely loyal to the country she had served. Barbara Bush said that Nancy had been totally devoted to her beloved husband, and that she and George took comfort in believing they would be reunited. Spokeswoman Joan Drake. Within hours, the tributes began pouring in from around the world. Arnold Schwarzenegger wrote that she had served with unbelievable power, class, and grace. Her stepson Michael wrote something simpler and more direct, that she was once again with the man she loved. On March 11, 2016, 5 days after her death, Nancy Reagan was buried at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Semi Valley, California. The funeral drew 10 former First families. Former President George W. Bush was there. Michelle Obama represented the current administration. Former First Ladies Laura Bush and Rosalind Carter attended. Hillary Clinton, then campaigning for the Democratic presidential nomination, attended. Presidential children Caroline Kennedy and Tricia Nixon Cox were among the mourners. She was laid to rest beside Ronald Reagan on the hillside at the library, looking out over the Santa Susana Mountains and the valley below. He had once told his biographer, Edmund Morris, that when the time came, they would seal the door temporarily until she joined him, and then they would lie there, just the two of them, and look at the sea together. She was 94. He had died at 93. Between them, they had lived nearly 2 full centuries, and now it was done. Segment 1, What She Paid. Legacy of a Complicated Woman. The question of how to understand Nancy Reagan, what she was, what she did, what she cost, and what she gave does not resolve itself easily. It never has. She came to Washington as a Hollywood actress with a reputation for glamour and a singular consuming devotion to her husband. She left it after 8 years as one of the most influential and least understood first ladies in American history. Not because she held formal power. She never pretended to that, but because she understood that proximity to power wielded carefully was a form of power in itself. She had pushed to have a chief of staff fired. She had lobbied foreign policy advisors. She had quietly shaped the president's schedule for years through channels that most of the country didn't know existed. She had nudged her husband, by most reliable accounts, toward engaging with the Soviet Union at a moment when hawks in the administration were opposed to it. And whatever you think of astrology or motives, those negotiations eventually led to the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 and helped thaw a Cold War that had defined the whole of her adult life. She had also been vain and protective and sometimes ruthless. She had feuded publicly, had held grudges, had been willing to use the press as a weapon when it suited her. She was not a saint. She would have been the first to tell you so. Her relationship with her own children was proof enough of that. Patty Davis had spent years not just estranged from her parents, but actively writing about the distance between them in a novel, in a memoir, in public interviews. The rift had been painful for everyone. Michael Reagan, Ronald's adopted son from his first marriage, had his own complicated history with the family, shaped by a difficult early life that had little to do with Nancy directly, but cast shadows over their relationships nonetheless. Ron Reagan Jr. had broken from the conservative politics his parents embodied. Even at the height of her White House power, Nancy Reagan had not managed to hold the family together in the ways a First Lady's image often suggests. That gap between the public portrait and the private reality was one she carried. But she had also sat beside a man who no longer knew her name and held his hand every day for years. She had built a public health initiative around the disease that was taking him. She had spoken openly about breast cancer at a time when women were expected to suffer that privately. She had spent her 80s alone, widowed and physically diminishing, still showing up to protect a legacy that was no longer in danger of being forgotten. Power for Nancy Reagan was never purely political. It was personal. It was the power to protect the thing she loved most. And that thing, Ronnie, always Ronnie, had been gone for 12 years by the time she died. She spent those 12 years making sure the world did not forget him. That is the price she paid. And it is also the thing she chose. She once said plainly that her life began when she married Ronald Reagan. Many people found that kind of statement hard to understand. A brilliant, capable woman defining herself entirely in relation to another person. But she was not being self-deprecating. She was being precise. That was in her own accounting the truth of her life. And she never apologized for it, not once, not even at the very end. The woman in that photograph outside the Capitol, the one standing alone beside the casket, looking like the world has gone silent. She knew exactly who she was. She had always known. It just cost her everything to stay that way. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.